Hello, hello, and welcome to Talking All Things Cardiopulm. I am your host, Dr. Rachel Barisi. Before we get into today's episode, I'd like to introduce our sponsor, Jane, a clinic management software and EMR. The team at Jane understands that clocking out from the clinic doesn't always mean you're clocking out for the day. Instead, it's often the start of charting long into the evening. With time-saving chart features like custom smart narratives, chart duplication, and dictation, Jane helps you finish charting your patient or client notes during work hours, not after hours. And to save you even more time, you have access to Jane's chart template library that's fully stocked with pre-made templates that have been generously shared by practitioners in the community. You can even customize them further with charting tools like side-by-side photos, checkboxes, and range scales. To see how Jane can help you free up your evenings from administrative tasks, head to the show notes to book a personalized demo. But if you're ready to get started, you can use the code CardioPulm1MO at the time of signup for a 1-month grace period applied to your new account. Thanks again, Jane. All right. We are back from New York, New Jersey, back from the beach, back into life. And I'm just like a broken record. We're like cruising into July right now. And something about this year, I think specifically, has just been moving so fast, and the summer even more so. I sent out a newsletter to my newsletter group. If you're not on that, link is in the show notes. Just really about not being able to catch up. And I felt this way when I was in the clinic full time, sometimes going away or going out of town or like prepping to go out of town is more work than just like staying in the normal routine. And so we had 2 quick trips, one in May, we headed to Michigan, we drove, and one in June, we flew, which is really not that long of a flight, to New York. And it's kicking my ass. I feel like the adulting tasks are just like I'm like struggling to get it done. It's either the garden's up to par or the house is unkempt. If the house is up to par, whatever's happening outside. And then you kind of throw in business and hospital work, and adulting's hard. For everyone who's listening, I know you know this, but man, adulting is feeling a little bit hard. So finally kind of catching up. We're trying to really capitalize on our days off to get things done, which also is hard, right? Because like you need time off, but we are almost officially done with our garden pavers. 100% took longer than we thought, or I thought. Nikki was like, that's not a 1-day project. She was right. I was wrong. I don't know how many days we're on, but I think we have about 1 to 2 more nights left, and we might be able to like get going. But we had such a drastic switch in seasons, and I feel like it's been happening more and more. We had like a late rainy spring, and then we went from this like robust storms and coolish weather to like August heat. And I don't, if you're, listening and you're around the country, not a lot of people know what the weather in Kansas is. And so I'm born and raised on the East Coast. I will tell you for a fact that people on the East Coast really don't have a sense of the middle of the country. And I call Kansas the middle. I mean, like we're smack dab in the middle. My dad's always like, oh, it's cold there, right? I'm like, no, it's like 110 degrees in August. It's hot and it's like wet heat, even though we're landlocked, right? So just really such a switch in temps. It has been like very hard to regulate the garden. And I think I said this maybe in the last episode. I typically don't complain about the heat, period. And if you saw in my stories, I was doing work outside. It was like creeping to 103 degrees, and I was just about getting uncomfortable. It's not about me. It's about my plants. And they're just having a really hard time. So everything I got in the ground first, like in the garden boxes early, are doing okay. Because I think they were strong enough. They had plenty of water. The whole bit. The newer plants that I got into the pots are not, they just cannot make it. So I have a couple of plants on backup, but they're just not big enough to withstand this heat. I mean, it's impossible. And moving these things into the shade is just like I would be moving things all day. So um garden is holding up. It is literally work to keep them alive. I literally just switched out a zucchini plant because 3 of them went down. And I have an umbrella literally on top of my new zucchini plant because if I don't, that thing is going to be done within an hour. So, trying to set it up for success. And if you've listened to me before, that's usually like a true statement for so many things in my life is like you have to set the plants up for success. You have to set your students up for success. And this is a comment to you and to me as well because I'm having a hard time with this. You have to set yourself up for success, and so you have to know kind of what is going to motivate you, push you, focus, and kind of get things done. And that is what I have been focusing on this week. With that being said, I told you I was going to be digging into the literature a little bit more on respiratory muscle training. So RMT is something I have been interested in for years, probably right around the end of my residency. I started to get into RMT. And so just kind of a recap, respiratory muscle training is usually defined as resistive breathing exercises using some sort of training device. I like to say RMT because RMT indicates that we're focusing on both inhale and exhale. And in my opinion, that is superior. Now, that is just my opinion. The research is growing, and there isn't a ton of differentiation between IMT and, let's say, RMT, like the combination. But I haven't come across it yet, or maybe I just haven't hit the right search yet. But in my opinion, if you're going to be adding load to breathing, we should be adding load to both inhale and exhale. One of the things that, so I was doing a case study a few years back. RMT was going to be my research line, and then COVID hit and sort of like derailed most things. And I literally finished a case study right as we went on lockdown, and I have not written it up yet. So my goal is to write up this case study. And with that, I'm kind of digging back into the literature. One of the most profound things that I saw in the pre and post of this case was improvement in blood pressure. So now the overall goal for this case study was I had an adult asthmatic, and I was trying to see if RMT would improve this patient's MIP and MEP and potentially improve their dyspnea and overall exercise capacity, because she had been having more episodes of dyspnea on exertion, things like that. She did have improvement in her MIP and MEP. I have not run the stats on it yet, if it's considered significant or not. But the most profound thing that I noticed was improvement in her blood pressure. I mean, it was phenomenal. So nothing changed medication-wise, but the biggest change was in her systolic blood pressure. I don't have her case in front of me, but I think she ran between 140s and 160s, and I believe there was even weeks where she was a bit higher right at the start. And by the end of the 12 weeks, and it actually ended up being more weeks because she had a respite in between because she had like the flu. She was sustaining like low 120s for multiple weeks. And I was like, wow, this has to be something. So that was now at least 5 years ago. And so the question I really wanted to start to dive into is, can breathing exercises, diaphragmatic breathing, RMT, improve blood pressure control? Because let's think about like the overall question here. Is there something else that we can do as clinicians and humans to help control blood pressure, right? So like we know we can effectively decrease hypertension with lifestyle change, which includes diet, exercise, stress management, good sleep hygiene, right? There's a number of things that you can do. But what tends to happen is we lean more on medication management to help control blood pressure, especially if we have patients who are sitting in that greater than 140/90 category. So, what if there's something else that we could do that's maybe not so time intensive that can help blood pressure, right? So, the question really is, can breathing exercise help improve blood pressure control? And the simple answer is yes. So then the follow-up question is, can breathing exercises without load help blood pressure? The answer is yes. Can breathing exercise with resistive load help control blood pressure? The answer is yes. Does it help normotensive, prehypertensive, and hypertensive patients? The answer is yes. This is so amazing. So the part of the research that is still kind of, I don't want to say lacking, but maybe needs more consistency is on protocol. And this is common across most literature with aerobic exercise, strength training, and now breathing exercises. What is that protocol that is like going to give you the most bang for your buck? I found two really good articles that I'm kind of going to be going between today. One was on just diaphragmatic breathing, and the other was RMT. And it was actually RMT versus no load. They both articles showed change in and benefit in decreasing blood pressure, decreasing MAP, decreasing heart rate, improving heart rate variability, right? Like there's just like this amount of information that is coming from the ability to add breathing exercises into your routine. So I get really excited about this because I think this is one of those pieces that we're just not utilizing, and it's non-pharmacologic, right? No side effects or minimal at best. So the big question is like, what's the protocol, right? So there's a lot of variability, anywhere between like 30 minutes of breathing exercises, 30 minutes of diaphragmatic breathing, 30 minutes of RMT, 1 to 2 times a day for somewhere between 4 and 12 weeks. That's one like protocol versus 30 reps 2 times a day for, again, 4 to 12 weeks. So there's variability in the frequency of like how much time for how long, and then how long do those benefits last, as well as how many times do you do this exercise, how many reps, what's your rest time in between, how many times a day, right? So there's still a lot that can be figured out. There's a lot of variability, but with that being said, even though there is this significant variability in like frequency and prescription of breathing exercises, they're showing benefit pretty much in most protocols, and the benefits are lasting. So I believe one article suggested that detraining, so like undoing of said protocol, didn't take effect until 9 weeks post stopping that exercise routine. So there's carryover. But obviously, once you stop, there's going to be that regression back. So similar to exercise, similar to diet, similar to sleep hygiene, similar to now breathing exercises, there is a continuous nature that is required to maintain the benefits. So I think just super cool. So in this one article is a literature review on diaphragmatic breathing. Essentially, the goal was achieving somewhere between 6 to 10 breaths per minute for X period of time. So that somewhere equates to like a 5-to-5 ratio. If it was me doing the protocol, I would probably lean to something in the 1-to-2 ratio and then extend from there. So maybe a 4-to-6 would be my suggestion, because I would kind of hit the same time period. But again, lots of variability, but big things that came out of it. So some changes seen in just diaphragmatic breathing, no load. decrease heart rate somewhere between 2 to 4 beats per minute in both prehypertensive and hypertensive patients after about 2 to 4 weeks of training. The heart rate component seems to not have as big of a change as the blood pressure component, but it's still affecting it. Seems to have improvement in heart rate variability, and heart rate variability is hot right now. I will be doing a podcast solely on that in the future, but it improved both power and standard deviation of time in that variation between R to R interval. So improving heart rate variability, and the MAP changes were pretty significant. So for patients who were on hypertensive meds, they had a decrease in MAP by 6.5 millimeters of mercury in about 8 weeks. In the pre-hypertensive patients, it was actually even greater. It was a decrease in MAP by 8.9. And then when you increase that time to about 12 weeks, we increased, or I should say decreased, MAP greater by 12.7 millimeters of mercury. So that's pretty significant, right? Like a change in 10 millimeters of mercury is going to have effect on the body as well as your medication dose, right? So now, can they start talking about maybe decreasing your meds or taking one away if they're on a multi-med regimen, right? So lots of different pieces to this that I think are just like phenomenal. And this specific study also looked at anxiety, and their anxiety and depression scores also decreased with just diaphragmatic breathing. Again, no load added. So incorporating breathing exercises with your patients, period, is going to have a physiologic effect outside of just breathing mechanics. Okay. Then looking at the RMT side of it, where we're actually using a device, we're actually adding load. Again, there's a variability of how much load do you add. Somewhere around 30 to 50% of MIP was like a common threshold. And same thing, seeing changes in decrease in MAP, some decrease in heart rate, improvement in heart rate variability. And so essentially there's like a lot of theory about, well, how is this happening, right? So just thinking about the mechanics of the diaphragm. As the diaphragm drops inferiorly with inhale, we're going to increase abdominal pressure. And then as we have exhalation and the diaphragm moves superiorly, we're going to have increase in our thoracic pressure and a decrease in abdominal pressure. So there is a venous return piece to this. Now, typically when I have taught breathing exercises and like its effect on venous return, a lot of us tend to lean towards improvement in venous return, because when you have that change in pressure, right, we have this movement of gradient, and everything in our body, or most things in our body, move across a gradient from high to low. So when we inhale, we drop the diaphragm down, we increase pressure in abdominal cavity. When we exhale, now we're going from high to low. We're going to increase venous return, which can then improve stroke volume. This would be considered during the exhalation phase, right? A lot of these articles really focus on the opposite side of this, that during inhalation, when you have this increase in abdominal pressure, you're going to have a decrease in venous return in that moment, which then decreases stroke volume, is going to kind of relieve pressure on the heart. So it was an interesting take, because I've actually, although, think about this process a lot, haven't ever taken it from that viewpoint. So I guess then you can think about both sides of it, right? Like you're having variability in that stroke volume, in that cardiac output period between inhale and exhale. The other piece of it is thinking about some of the heart rate variability is really the autonomic regulation. And so when you're performing breathing exercises, the theory is that we're decreasing sympathetic input and increasing parasympathetic input. And sometimes I feel like that might be a little bit too simplistic in kind of conversation. When we're thinking about inhale, exhale, as we extend our exhale, we are increasing that parasympathetic firing. And so if you're increasing parasympathetic firing, your sympathetic is going to be turned off in that period. If you're having more firing of that parasympathetic, you're really regulating better. And I think that's a good way to think about sympathetic, parasympathetic. One's not bad, one's not good. It's really just that regulation of on off, because that's how our body works. The other piece of this is that the diaphragm literally is kind of massaging the vagal nerve, right? So you're getting more vagal input. Vagus connects with parasympathetic. So you're kind of improving vagal tone when you're performing breathing exercises, loaded or not loaded. So just kind of an interesting take when we think about like POTS and other autonomic problems, even COVID. We have this like underlying low vagal tone. And so if we start to perform things like breathing exercises, we can actually improve the tone in our vagus nerve, or improve vagal tone is kind of the verbiage that you would use. So essentially you're stimulating parasympathetic, right? So something to consider here, which is kind of like, this is me breaking down this information again. If you're thinking about sympathetic, parasympathetic, I don't know if I've done a podcast on that yet. I'm going to add it to the list. This would actually be a good, quick and dirty for both students and clinicians. The heart and the lungs are affected by sympathetic, parasympathetic input, right? And so in theory, when you have a nerve and it fires, you're going to have a very quick input. So sympathetic affects beta 1 and beta 2. Beta 1 for the heart, beta 2 for the lungs. When it is stimulated and it's hitting beta 1, we're going to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, increase contraction, increase cardiac output. If we're stimulating beta 2, we're going to have bronchodilation of the lungs. On the parasympathetic side, we also affect beta 1 and beta 2. And when we affect beta 1, we're going to decrease heart rate and decrease blood pressure. But fun fact about parasympathetic input to the heart is that it does not innervate the ventricles the same way that the sympathetic system does, because it's kind of like a backup system, right? You don't ever want blood pressure to fully quit. So it does not decrease blood pressure, cardiac output, as well as sympathetic increases blood pressure, cardiac output. Has some effect, just not as much. And then from the beta 2 side, it actually causes bronchoconstriction. So really kind of thinking about how this can play into inhale, exhale, sympathetic, parasympathetic, right? You could, in theory, manipulate your breathing pattern to be more sympathetic or more parasympathetic, right? If you're going to speed up your breathing rate and go with like a 1-to-1 ratio, you're going to be firing more sympathetic. Versus if I'm trying to lean towards this like 6 to 10 breaths per minute, you're extending your exhale, you're going to be more parasympathetic. Okay. So it's going to play a role on bringing your heart rate down, bringing your blood pressure down, right? But I think what is important to consider is that it's not just the firing, right? It's not just turning one on, it's regulating sympathetic and parasympathetic. It's pushing parasympathetic and inhibiting sympathetic in one moment. And then just from the next piece of this is what a lot of people don't think about in the world of parasympathetic is not just rest and digest, it's also recovery. So when you stop exercise and you're coming back to resting, or you're setting resting heart rate, that's parasympathetic. So if you can tap into that system, you're going to improve recovery time. You're going to have a lower resting heart rate potentially, like in theory. One more piece to kind of throw into this mix is baroreflex. Actually, I got two more pieces. Baroreflex is one of them. So baroreflex is really your body's regulation of blood pressure. And we have these receptors in our aorta and carotid arteries. And essentially, they play a role in adjusting blood pressure if we change position. And it's also like a resetting mechanism from day to day. So in theory, your blood pressure sort of resets, and I'm air quoting resets every 24 hours based on cardiac baroreceptor, baroreflex sort of pathophys. And in theory, if you're, let's say, really stressed and you're like chronically stressed and your heart rate is chronically high, your blood pressure is starting to creep up, it starts resetting at that higher level. And so it just keeps, elevating. In theory, or based on the literature, we're seeing that breathing exercises, diaphragmatic breathing, RMT, is also promoting a better regulation of the baroreceptors, the baroreflex component. So that seems to be the side of like lowering the blood pressure and helping it maintain at a lower set rate, essentially. So I think that's like super cool, really affecting the physiology within the body. And then the last piece, and I might do a podcast on this one too, is something called the metaboreflex, the respiratory metaboreflex. And essentially, I don't know if I've talked about this before. I learned about this when I was doing a poster presentation on RMT and gait speed. And in one of the articles, they were looking at the metaboreflex, and I was like, I'm not that familiar with this. So essentially, the respiratory metaboreflex is a backup mechanism, essentially, that prevents you from becoming too dyspneic that you cannot continue. So let me put this in different words. The metaboreflex essentially, as you're fatiguing, let's say with exercise, is going to decrease blood flow to the periphery, to the skeletal muscles, like in the legs, let's say I'm running, to focus more blood flow to the diaphragm so that I keep breathing, right? It's prioritizing breath control over running, right? It's shutting down, it's causing fatigue in the legs so that you stop running and I'm just getting blood flow to the diaphragm. So essentially, it's a reflex. In theory, with other patient populations like heart failure, this happens with, household ambulation. Patient becomes fatigued because they are dyspneic on exertion, and essentially the diaphragm is saying, hey, calf muscles, I'm more important, so blood flow's got to come to me. And so the patient gets fatigued and needs to sit. Breathing exercises, RMT, can help improve this respiratory metaboreflex, essentially improve the mechanics of the diaphragm so that it is more efficient and, aerobically capable, so that it's not fatiguing the skeletal muscles faster. And so that seems to also have some carryover. So it's just some really cool stuff in the world of RMT and breathing exercises. So like, rule of thumb here, start teaching your patients how to breathe. It is so beneficial in so many different categories. This is just like touching the surface of one specific area. And I'm talking about blood pressure, right? I'm not even talking about the lungs in this situation. But even having the conversation of this is your diaphragm, this is how you activate it, can be so beneficial. This was good because I have a couple of ideas generating, including an impromptu breathing assessment that happened when I was home with a young, active athlete who was literally awaiting D1 calls. So I'll be talking about that assessment. I wish I had it on video. I was not thinking in the moment to like record this, but this would have been awesome. So you got a couple of episodes that are going to be upcoming. We're going to talk about paradoxical breathing in even the young. We're going to talk about the metaboreflex in a little bit more in detail. And then I want to get into the baroreceptor response as well. But it gets really scientific when you start diving into the physiology. So I'm just going to keep breaking it down to make it more digestible, because I think it's a super important piece that is affected by breathing exercises and lots of other things, so bed rest and all sorts of fun stuff. All right. If you have any questions, please reach out to me on Instagram at All Things Cardial Pulm. You can shoot me an email. I'll have all my contact information below. Text messaging is also preferred because emails kind of get bogged down. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this episode, please drop me some stars, write a great review. It is 100% appreciated. And if you are looking for a mentor, if you're sitting for the CCS, if you are in a DPT program and you're just struggling with cardial pulm, I have one-on-one calls available. So just click down below to get scheduled in. All right. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and whatever you have to do, get after it.